Well, we start our series in E100 looking through the Bible tonight in the beginning, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. This continues for the next 6 days as God creates. Now I'd like to start with a question tonight. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, the only way to know the answer to this question is to go back to the beginning. In fact, the beginning is a good place to go to learn a lot about our world and who we are. And there have been people who have tried to go back to the beginning to understand more about how we and our world were created. And I'm not just talking about Michael J. Fox in the Back to the Future movies. A group of about 10,000 scientists have been working with the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, trying to recreate the Big Bang by throwing atomic particles into each other as fast as they can, and then observing the substance that is created in the process. I thought we could try this with 2 eggs to answer our question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, apparently these scientists were successful. They created a mini Big Bang with huge temperatures as the atoms melted together into a liquid substance called quark-gluon plasma. Probably the same result we would get with our eggs. And it sounds like a lot of fun, doesn't it? But it doesn't sound successful to me. I mean, where is the mini universe created? Where is the mini world I can hold in my hands? Where is the mini me? The point that I'm trying to make here is that we can't recreate creation. None of us were there in the beginning to observe what happened, or even what elements were involved. We have no empirical, historical, or scientific evidence of what happened in creation, because none of us were yet created to observe it. We can see the effects of creation around us, but no one saw what happened in the beginning except for one, the Creator, God himself. And fortunately, he has chosen to reveal some information about what he created and why. And we find this in Genesis 1 to 11. And we start with this simple but richly powerful 4 words. In the beginning, God. We ask, how was the world created? When was this world created? But it turns out that we have got the questions wrong. And God tells us what we really need to know, which is not the how and when of creation. Galileo once said, "The Bible is not preeminently concerned with telling us how the heavens go. The Bible is, instead, most concerned with telling us how to go to heaven." Genesis is not an account of God's technique in creation. It is not a scientific textbook, but it is an account of his character and his intent in creation. And if you ask yourself at each sentence, what does this reveal about God, you will have a rich experience of this book. And so as you read this, it will not answer every question about how the heavens go, but it will point you to the God who can bring you to heaven. And that's what the book of Genesis is all about. But even within Christian circles, we've got caught up in the arguments of the how and the when. There are those on one extreme, the creationists, who argue that we need to read the text literally as if it was an accurate historical description. 7 24-hour days, a real talking snake, man made from the dust and woman from the rib bone. They argue fiercely for a young earth, maybe 5 to 10,000 years old. And then there are those on the other side who would say that the whole thing is a myth. It's just a nice story that was invented so that the Israelites would have a creation story. They would argue that the world is not created in 7 literal days, that the earth is in fact billions of years old. Some of these people argue the points on either extreme so strongly that they believe if you disagree with their point of view on Genesis, then you undermine the saving work of Jesus. The new atheists will say this as well. They will say that evolution disproves Christianity because it is opposed to a literal reading of Genesis. Well, I'm confident that you don't come up with any of these conclusions by simply reading the text, especially if you read it in its historical context. Why? Because they are asking the wrong questions when they come to the text. They are asking scientific questions of how and when the text tells us theological truths of who and why. In that context, evolution is not the problem or the challenge to Christianity that the new atheists and the creationists perceive it to be. I myself do not believe in evolution, but I know many Christians who do, and who believe the theological truths of Genesis. The historical and scientific questions about how and when the world was created are interesting, but they are not the topic of Genesis, and probably not something that we will completely know in our lifetime. In terms of when, all that Genesis says is when the world was created was in the beginning. That is all we need to know, that it was created when it was created. In Hebrew, the word simply means at some time. At some time the world was created, and that's all we need to know. What is important is that God is the creator. The important thing is the word following in the beginning. In the beginning, God. God created the heavens and the earth. This is extremely important in our setting and in the original historic setting. We see around the time that this was written ancient Near Eastern myths such as the Egyptian sun god Ra and the Babylonian story of Enuma Elish. In this setting, these stories were given to explain how creation came into being in a mythological manner. They're stories of gods fighting each other, and out of the chaos of them fighting each other, somehow the world came into being and humanity came into being to serve these gods. And in this context, there needed to be something correcting the theological inconsistencies, the theological mistakes of these mythical stories and worldviews that the Israelites were given as they left Egypt and were preparing for the promised land. So it's in the context of correcting these false myths explaining creation, that these false worldviews that the Israelites had picked up. And now that they've left Egypt and are going into the promised land, God is correcting their false worldviews, their incorrect theological positions about creation by giving them a new story. And it is a genre of myth to oppose these myths. Now, the mythological genre doesn't mean that it is incorrect. A myth is simply a story used to explain or justify a belief. It doesn't mean that it is not true, and it doesn't mean that it is not accurate. Nor does it mean that you can say the same thing about other texts in the Bible. Context is extremely important, and that includes the genre and the purpose of the writing. The Gospels and the resurrection are historical. There are 3 biographies on Jesus' life in Matthew, Mark, and John, and we have the historical monograph of Luke, Acts, as well as secular extra-biblical historians who record the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and that is their purpose, and we know them to be true. The purpose of Genesis is seen in the context of a people rescued by God, walking in the wilderness and awaiting a new land as God's people. But before they can start afresh as God's new nation, He needs to correct the false worldview and understanding of creation that they have been exposed to. Their worldview did not need to be corrected historically or scientifically because that was not the problem. It needed to be corrected theologically. Today, after 3,500 years, Genesis still remains, and it still challenges the false worldviews that we have today, such as that presented by the new atheists. The first and the main point that Genesis 1 to 11 tells us is that there is a creator and that He is God. And this means the same thing whether you are an evolutionist or a literalist, a young or an old earther, or someone reading this text for the very first time. The main point, which is made abundantly clear, is this: God made what we see, all of it, the heavens and the earth, from top to bottom. It is all his handiwork. He has the power to do it, and by his word and in his time frame, whenever and however that was. And according to his purposes, God made this world, and he did a tip-top job. Shows me that he is powerful. He is transcendent. He made it out of nothing, and he is not bound to it. And he is in control. God is the architect, which is my second point tonight. He is the ordered designer. Now, I'm a messy person. If you've seen my office, you would know that I understand chaos. And I can tell you that chaos does not bring about order. This world did not come about by atomic particles, which didn't exist anyway, flying chaotically around space until they hit each other at great speed, causing a chaotic explosion from which we received a nice, ordered, living universe. Chaos does not bring about order. If I was to put a bomb in my office, I should not expect to find my papers all ordered neatly on my desk and all the sound equipment back in the sound room where it should be. Order does not come from chaos. It works the other way. God brings order to chaos because our God is a God of order who planned this to be the way that it is before he spoke it into being. In saying this, I'm not ruling out the possibility that God could have used the means of our scientific theories like the Big Bang or natural selection as part of his creation process. The point that I'm making is that this was planned. It was not an accident or a fluke. It was not hit and miss. God is the great architect. He designed and planned our world to be what it is. Now, I don't read Hebrew, but apparently the first chapter of Genesis is not only beautifully poetic in its description of creation, but it is also meticulously ordered. And we can even pick it up in the English. The 7 days show how God planned and structured order and intent in creation. Each day he accomplishes something which is built upon the next day. It is clear that nothing happened by mistake, as evolution might apply. Nothing happened by fluke, like the Big Bang. The world was not created by a fallout of different gods fighting each other, like the other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts. But creation was ordered according to God's plan. Even if you want to accept the contemporary theories, you can't discount the Genesis account. In fact, the Genesis account makes the Big Bang and evolution more plausible in my eyes. An ordered God controlling these events seems much more likely than them just happening. We see this order in the 6 days. The first day, God creates light. The second day, he separates the waters, and we have the skies and the waters. The third day, the waters gather, and we have the land and the seas. The fourth day, the sun, moon, and the stars, that's time. The fifth day, the fish and the birds fill the skies and the waters. The sixth day, animals to fill the land, and humans to care for the land and to speak and relate to God. So what did God do each day? On each of the 6 days, he spoke. And I believe that every day God continues to speak things into being in our world. He is not a distant landlord who does an inspection every 6,000 years. He is intimately involved with this world and wants to speak things into being in your life. God liked what he made because it all happened as he ordered according to his plan. But there are 2 days that he describes differently. They are the Friday, which was very good, as he created humanity, the pinnacle of his creation, which we'll return to shortly. Monday is not described as good. Maybe this is because God had Monday-itis. Back to the Friday, he saved the best for last. In terms of eating my food, I always save the best thing on my plate for last. And here in the creation account, God saves the best to last, humanity. What does this mean for us? Well, we don't come from nothing by nothing for no reason. This is something that I just can't understand about atheism. There is nothing. We are here by accident. There is no point to our existence. And there is nothing outside of this world we know. There is nothing after death. But what Genesis tells me is that you didn't come from nothing, by nothing, for no reason. You came from the heart of God, by a mighty act of God, for the purposes that God ordained. Which brings me to my third point tonight. The pinnacle of God's creation, mankind. Which we'll look at in a minute. But I just wanted to continue talking about order for a second. God's order shows his victory over chaos. In Genesis 1 and 2, we see a picture of God creating out of nothing, and what is first created is described as formless and empty. But within this emptiness is a chaotic darkness and waters of some description, and the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. From this chaos, order is created by God's word. This shows me his victory over the Babylonian myth, where the waters united in a chaotic turn of events to create gods and then humans to serve the gods. God is more powerful than the waters and brings order to the chaos. When we hear the story of the Big Bang, of a collision of particles, and what followed that, what was created was a liquid or waters that contain the original properties for life. And evolution is what brought those to what we have now. God is more powerful than any waters created by a chaotic explosion. There is no chaos in God's plan. He ordered it, he planned it, and he spoke it into being. In Genesis 1:26-31, humanity is presented as the pinnacle of God's creation. Creation is shown in this text as God's treasure. He finds joy in what he has created, and man and woman are his most prized treasure. And this is highlighted most significantly in chapter 1, verse 26, where God says, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." Being made in the image of God, or being made to be like God, brings about some special responsibilities. We're firstly told to care for creation. God has entrusted us to his creation for us to rule over. And if we are made in God's likeness, we ought to look after it the way that God would want us to look after it. We ought to look after creation with the utmost respect for its creator. We also see in the image of God a desire for relationship. Our God is a relational God, and we see this here in this verse where God says, "Let us make mankind in our image." God is a relational God, Father, Son, and Spirit, 3 in 1. And God created humanity to be in relationship with him. He would walk with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. And what distinguished humanity from the rest of creation was the ability to have a deep and mutual relationship with each other and with God. This is highlighted in chapter 2, where God says that it is not good for a man to be alone, and he created a wife for Adam. Freedom is another aspect of being created in God's likeness. Freedom is very significant in our relationship with God. You see, forced love is not love, it is rape. And God did not want to force us to love him, so he gave us an opportunity, a choice that we could choose other than him. And he placed that choice, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in the middle of the garden next to the tree of life, from which he sustained and nourished Adam and Eve. He said, "Eat from any tree, but not this one." And we all know the story. After they were tempted by Satan, they ate of the fruit. This shows me a few things about humanity. Firstly, there are spiritual forces opposed to humanity, and we see here in this story Satan. Secondly, we are inclined to choose our own way over God's. And when we do that, the consequences are serious and lead firstly to separation from God. And then a humanity separate from God spirals into disarray. We have fallen away from God's order to chaos and depravity, and this is outlined in the rest of Genesis as we see murder, incest, lying, stealing, and so on. But in Genesis, we also have a hope. This leads me to my final point tonight. that despite the fact that God is disgusted with the injustice and immorality, with the lack of spirituality and lack of respect for our Creator, God still wants a relationship with His treasured creation. He still wants us to have freedom. And in the rest of our series in E100, we will show the story of God's plan to restore you and to restore me to what He intended us to be. There is hope in future freedom. I've heard it said that the beginning echoes the end. And in the beginning there was God in a garden walking with man and woman. It seems perfect. It seems like heaven. But what I see foreshadowed again and again of Jesus in the Old Testament is just that, a shadow of who Jesus really was and is. God promised restoration, and Jesus has made a way for restoration, and He will make all things new. But I firmly believe that His aim is not to take us back to Eden, but to move us forward into His eternal kingdom, to heaven. And as the beginning echoes the end, the garden is a foreshadow of our eternal life with God. Yet it is just a taste of what we will experience when Jesus brings about a new heavens and a new earth. So what came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, my answer, according to my reading of Genesis, is it doesn't matter. 7 days or billions of years, a real snake or a representation of a spiritual being, none of it is important. What matters is that God came first and that He planned that the chicken would come from the egg and the egg would come from the chicken. He spoke it into being and it is. Genesis 1-11 is not a historical account or a scientific explanation of creation, nor is it merely a myth or a dream's time fable. These texts, which we are reading this week in our E100 devotions, are primarily theological. These words are how God has chosen to poetically, accurately, and powerfully communicate to us the theological truths that we need to know about the beginnings of our world and the beginnings of us as a human race. And the theological truths that I want you to take away from here tonight are that God is the creator, that God is the architect, that man has a special and unique place in God's plan but has broken relationship with God, but that God had a plan for our restoration from the very beginning. So as you read Genesis 1-11 over the next week, continue to ask yourself, what does this say about the character of God? What truths is God revealing about Himself, about me, and about this world?